The pencil moved across the tactical assessment form with deliberate precision, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who had learned that rushing through paperwork meant missing critical details. The examination room at Nellis Air Force Base held 23 candidates, but only one drew confused glances from the others. Major Eva Kowalczyk sat in the back corner, her weathered flight jacket draped over her chair, silver streaks threading through dark hair pulled into a regulation bun. At 44, she was easily 15 years older than anyone else taking the Advanced Tactical Fighter Qualification exam. "Time," announced the proctor, a young lieutenant who couldn't hide his skepticism when collecting her papers. Eva had seen that look before, the polite confusion that asked why a transport pilot from the Air National Guard was even attempting to qualify for the Air Force's elite aggressor squadron. She stood slowly, her movements betraying the slight stiffness of old injuries that never quite healed right after her third deployment to Afghanistan. The door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Colonel Marcus Bishop filled the doorframe, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. His eyes swept across the candidates before locking onto Eva with an intensity that made several younger pilots step back. "Kowalczyk," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken history. "Iron Wolf." The examination room fell silent. That call sign, Iron Wolf, hadn't been spoken in any official capacity for 7 years. Not since the incident over the Hindu Kush that the Pentagon had classified beyond even most flag officers' clearance levels. Eva's expression remained neutral, but her left hand involuntarily moved to her right shoulder, where beneath her flight suit lay scars from shrapnel that had nearly ended everything. "Sir," she responded, her Polish accent barely detectable after decades of service, emerging only in moments of heightened tension. The younger pilots exchanged glances, suddenly reassessing the quiet woman they dismissed as someone's mother trying to relive glory days. They didn't know that Iron Wolf had once been the most feared close air support pilot in the entire coalition force, or that her A-10 Thunderbolt II had logged more combat hours than any other airframe in the war. Bishop's weathered face showed something between respect and concern. "My office, now." He turned on his heel and left, leaving behind a wake of whispered speculation. Eva gathered her materials methodically, ignoring the stares. As she reached the door, Lieutenant Rodriguez, one of the cockier F-35 pilots, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Guess the old guard still has connections." She paused at the threshold, not turning around. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "connections don't keep you alive when you're Winchester on ammunition, leaking hydraulic fluid and still making gun runs to cover a pinned-down convoy." The room went silent again. "They just make sure someone remembers your name when you don't come back." Bishop's office occupied the corner of the headquarters building, its windows overlooking the flight line where F-16 Vipers sat in neat rows, their gray forms shimmering in the Nevada heat. The colonel stood with his back to her, watching ground crews prepare aircraft for the afternoon sorties. The walls held the standard collection of squadron patches and photographs, but Eva's trained eye caught something unusual. A single, unmarked frame containing a grainy photograph of an A-10 silhouetted against mountain peaks, its wings laden with empty weapon stations, one engine trailing smoke. "That was some flying, Kowalczyk," Bishop said without turning around. "September 15, 2017, Shawicot Valley." He finally faced her, his expression unreadable. 43 runs, 7 hours, 217 confirmed saves. His voice dropped. "And one career-ending court of inquiry that somehow got buried so deep even I can't access the full file." Eva remained at attention, though Bishop hadn't formally required it. "Permission to speak freely, sir." When he nodded, she continued, "Why am I here, Colonel? My application for the aggressor squadron went through normal channels. My record is clean. My flight hours exceed requirements by a factor of 3. "Your record is sanitized," Bishop corrected. "There's a difference. Someone very high up wanted you to disappear quietly into the guard, fly cargo runs, and never touch a combat aircraft again." He pulled a file from his desk, its edges worn from handling. But here you are, taking qualification exams for a position that would put you back in a fighter cockpit. That takes either incredible courage or dangerous stupidity. Perhaps both, sir. For the first time, Eva allowed a slight smile. But after 7 years of flying supplies to state fairs and disaster zones, I need to know if I still have it. If what I did that day was skill or just lucky desperation. Bishop studied her for a long moment. The investigation board couldn't decide if you were a hero or a rogue, disobeying direct orders to abandon the valley, exceeding aircraft limitations by margins that Boeing engineers said were impossible, landing with structural damage that should have resulted in catastrophic failure. He paused. But you saved an entire battalion. I lost my wingman, Eva said quietly, the words hanging in the air like an accusation against herself. Captain Thomas Boxer Chen, 28 years old, wife, 2 kids. Her composure cracked slightly. He followed me back into that valley because he trusted my judgment. I told him we could make one more pass. And on that pass, you took out an entire mortar position that would have destroyed the field hospital, Bishop countered. Chen knew the risks, we all do. He moved to his window again, gesturing for her to join him. Outside, an F-16 rolled toward the runway, its pilot visible in the bubble canopy. That's Lieutenant Sarah Williams, top of her class at the weapons school. Never seen actual combat. She's technically perfect, follows every procedure, executes every maneuver by the book. Eva watched the aircraft begin its takeoff roll, the afterburner painting a cone of blue flame against the concrete. Books don't account for when everything goes wrong simultaneously, sir. No, they don't. Bishop turned to face her directly. Which is why I'm approving your transfer to the 64th Aggressor Squadron, effective immediately. We need someone who can teach these kids what real combat feels like. Someone who's been in the worst possible situation and found a way through. He handed her a set of orders. But understand this. There are people who won't be happy about Iron Wolf flying again. People who preferred you stayed buried. Eva took the orders, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what they represented. Let them come, sir. I've been fighting ghosts for 7 years. At least now I'll be back in the sky while I do it. She glanced at the patch on Bishop's desk, the 64th Aggressor Squadron emblem featuring a red star on black background. When do I start? Tomorrow, 0600. You'll be flying an F-16, not an A-10. Different beast entirely. Bishop's expression softened slightly. Think you can handle the transition from flying the Warthog to something with actual speed? Sir, the A-10 was designed to fly with half a wing missing and still bring its pilot home, Eva replied, allowing herself a fuller smile. The F-16 just has to not get hit. Seems like the easier job. She turned to leave, then paused. Colonel, why did you really bring me here? This wasn't chance. Bishop was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed her a video clip, shaky footage from a helmet cam, the audio filled with static and explosions. Through the chaos, a distinctive growl of GAU-8 cannon fire could be heard, followed by a calm female voice over the radio. Knife 3-1 is Winchester, but I'm not leaving. Not while you're still breathing down there. That video has been viewed 87 million times on platforms we can't officially acknowledge, Bishop said. Every pilot in this squadron has seen it. Half of them joined because of it. They just don't know Iron Wolf is real. He put the phone away. Tomorrow, they will. The walk to the quarters revealed the full scope of Nellis Air Force Base in the late afternoon. A small city dedicated to creating the world's finest fighter pilots. Eva passed groups of young aviators discussing energy management and Boyd's OODA loop, their enthusiasm reminding her of her own early days at Columbus Air Force Base. Back when the world seemed simple and flying was pure joy rather than calculated survival. Her assigned room was Spartan but sufficient. A single bed, desk, closet, and small window overlooking the mountains that bordered the Nevada Test and Training Range. Eva set down her single duffel bag, worn from decades of deployments, and unpacked methodically. Her flight gear emerged first, followed by a small wooden box she placed carefully on the desk. Inside were her challenge coins, accumulated over 22 years of service, each one a memory, a mission, a moment when death had passed close enough to leave its scent in the cockpit. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of Afghan silk, lay a different sort of memorial, a patch from Boxer Chen's flight suit, still bearing scorch marks from the fire that had consumed his aircraft. She'd cut it from the wreckage herself during the recovery operation, ignoring protocol and the investigation team's protests. They could court-martial her later, she'd thought at the time. They very nearly had. A knock interrupted her reverie. Through the door stood Captain Diana Volkov, whose Russian surname and sharp cheekbones had earned her the inevitable call sign, Tsarina. She was one of the aggressor pilots, trained to fly and fight like potential adversaries, pushing American pilots to their limits in training so they'd be ready for actual combat. Major Kowalczyk, Volkov said, her tone carefully neutral. Colonel Bishop asked me to brief you on tomorrow's flight schedule. She held a tablet displaying the next day's mission board. You're slotted for a familiarization flight at 600, then observing our morning evolution of basic fighter maneuvers against the 422nd Test Squadron. Eva noticed the younger woman's careful assessment, the way her eyes tracked to the challenge coins, the worn flight gear, the fact that Eva still maintained the physical conditioning of someone half her age despite the gray threading through her hair. And after observation, "That depends on your check ride," Volkov replied. "The F-16 isn't forgiving of pilots who try to fly it like something else." There was a challenge in her tone, subtle but present. "We've had transport pilots try to transition before. They usually wash out within a week." "I started in F-15 Eagles," Eva said mildly, continuing to unpack. "Before the A-10s, before everything else." She pulled out a flight manual for the F-16, its pages already marked with colored tabs. "But I appreciate the concern, Captain." Volkov's expression shifted slightly, reassessing. "You flew Eagles. That's not in your visible record." "Lots of things aren't in my visible record." Eva turned to face the younger pilot fully. "Tell me about the squadron, not the official briefing but the real story. Who's good, who's dangerous, who gets people killed trying to prove something?" The directness of the question caught Volkov off guard. After a moment, she entered the room properly and closed the door. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, who made that comment in the exam room. He's skilled but impulsive. Nearly caused a mid-air collision last month trying to prove he could outturn an F-22. Major Thompson is solid, conservative, but freezes up when scenarios go off script. Captain Martinez is probably our best stick-and-rudder pilot, but he's never seen actual combat, and it shows in his tactics." "And you?" Eva asked. "3 deployments, Syria and Afghanistan, mostly counter-ISIS operations, nothing like—" Volkov paused, then continued more quietly, "nothing like what you experienced. We've all seen the video, Major. The unauthorized one from the helmet cams, even if we're not supposed to admit it exists." Eva was quiet for a moment, then sat on the edge of the bed. "What you saw in that video was desperation, Captain, not heroics. When you run out of options and ammunition, but people are still counting on you, you do things that training says are impossible." She met Volkov's eyes. "My job here isn't to create heroes. It's to make sure none of you ever have to be that desperate." The evening air over Nelly's carried the distinctive scent of jet fuel and desert sage as Eva made her way to the flight line for an unofficial inspection. The maintainers were still working, their efforts illuminated by portable work lights that created pools of brightness against the darkening sky. She found the F-16 that would be hers tomorrow, tail number 870267, a Block 50 model with conformal fuel tanks and the latest avionics package. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation to the lieutenant, was supervising the engine inspection. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face showing the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades working under unforgiving sun. "Help you, Major." Just getting acquainted, Eva replied, running her hand along the aircraft's fuselage. The F-16 felt delicate compared to the A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit, designed to withstand direct hits from 23 cannon fire. This was a rapier where the Warthog had been a sledgehammer. "She's a good bird," Rodriguez said, warming slightly to someone who clearly appreciated aircraft. "Rebuilt the engine last month, updated the flight control software last week. She'll treat you right if you respect her limits." "And if you don't?" Eva asked, though she already knew the answer. "She'll kill you faster than you can realize you've made a mistake." The sergeant wiped his hands on a rag. "The Viper's honest that way. No second chances, no limping home on one engine. You're either flying or you're not." Eva nodded, appreciating the frankness. She'd moved from the F-16's forgiving predecessor, the F-15, to the A-10 specifically because the Warthog's resilience matched her philosophy of combat: survive first, everything else second. Now she was back in an aircraft that demanded perfection. As she walked the length of the aircraft, checking control surfaces and weapon stations with practiced eyes, her phone buzzed with a message from an unlisted number. "Some stones are better left unturned. Your reinstatement has been noticed." She deleted it without response. After 7 years, the threats were almost comforting in their consistency. The sun had fully set by the time she returned to her quarters, the base settling into its nighttime rhythm. Through her window, she could see the lights of Las Vegas glowing against the southern horizon, a reminder that normal life existed just miles from where pilots trained for war. She pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with tactical diagrams, lessons learned, and the names of those who hadn't come home. On a fresh page, she began writing. Day 1. The hardest part isn't the transition from one aircraft to another. It's the transition from one version of yourself to another. For 7 years, I've been Eva Kowalczyk, cargo pilot, invisible, safe. Tomorrow, Iron Wolf flies again. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her first combat mission, 20 years ago, when the weight of carrying weapons meant to kill had made her hands shake so badly she could barely manage the startup sequence. Her instructor then, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, had said something that still echoed. "The day it stops bothering you is the day you should stop flying." Eva wondered if it still bothered her, or if too much had been burned away in that valley. Her phone rang. Bishop's number. "Major, thought you should know. Word's already spreading about tomorrow. Half the base wants to see if Iron Wolf still has teeth." His tone carried a warning. "The other half wants to see you fail. Pressure's going to be intense." "Good," Eva replied. "Pressure is honest. It shows who people really are." She paused. "Sir, who exactly pushed for my application to be reconsidered? This didn't happen naturally." Bishop was quiet for a moment. "Let's just say you have friends in places neither of us can officially acknowledge. People who remember what you did and think the Air Force needs that kind of pilot again." Another pause. "Get some rest, Major. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." After ending the call, Eva stood at her window, watching an F-35 conduct a night landing, its approach lights cutting through the darkness like falling stars. Tomorrow, she would strap into an F-16 for the first time in 7 years, not as the broken pilot who'd been quietly shuffled away after defying orders, but as an instructor tasked with preparing the next generation for wars that might never come, or might come tomorrow. The ritual came back automatically as she prepared for bed, checking weather reports for tomorrow's flight conditions, reviewing the F-16's emergency procedures one more time, setting 3 alarms to ensure she'd wake with enough time for her personal pre-flight routine. Some habits, carved deep by years of discipline and survival, never faded. As she lay in the darkness, Eva thought about the young pilots she'd met today. They flew with technical precision she could only have dreamed of at their age, their training refined by decades of lessons learned in blood. But had that refinement made them soft? Would they make the hard choice when regulations said one thing but the screams on the radio demanded another? Her last thought before sleep was of Boxer Chin, forever 28, forever trusting her judgment as they rolled back into that valley one last time. Tomorrow, she would fly again. But tonight, she owed him the honesty of remembering exactly what that trust had cost. The alarm pierced the darkness at 4:30, unnecessary as Eva had been awake for 20 minutes already, her internal clock still calibrated to military precision. The desert morning carried a chill that would burn off within hours, leaving only heat that made the tarmac shimmer like water. She dressed methodically, flight suit pressed despite regulations not requiring it, boots polished to a shine that belonged to an earlier era of military service, patches aligned with microscopic precision. The officers' mess was nearly empty, only a handful of maintainers grabbing coffee before the day shift. Eva took her coffee black, strong enough to etch glass, the way she'd learned to drink it during endless alert duties in Kandahar. The young airman behind the counter looked at her patches, particularly the one indicating over 3,000 combat hours, with something approaching awe. Captain Volkov appeared precisely at 5:30, her own preparation evident in the crispness of her uniform. "Morning, Major. Weather's perfect, clear skies, minimal wind. The jet's pre-flighted and ready." She paused. "There's something else. Word got out about today. We've got an audience." Eva followed Volkov's gaze through the window to see nearly 40 personnel gathered near the flight line, far more than normal for a routine qualification flight. Among them, she recognized several of the pilots from yesterday's exam, including Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose skepticism seemed to have transformed into curiosity. "Let them watch," Eva said, draining her coffee. "Maybe they'll learn something." She stood, checking her G-suit connections one more time. "Or maybe they'll see an old pilot make a fool of herself. Either way, it's educational." The walk to the aircraft felt longer than it was, each step carrying the weight of 7 years of exile. The F-16 waited on the ramp, its single engine already whining at idle, courtesy of the ground crew. Sergeant Rodriguez stood by with the forms, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes showing interest. "She's all yours, Major," he said, handing over the paperwork. "Treat her right." Eva performed her walk around with deliberate thoroughness, checking every surface, every connection, every potential point of failure. The habit had saved her life more than once, finding a hydraulic leak that would have caused total failure over hostile territory, catching a bird strike damage that could have resulted in engine failure on takeoff. The F-16 was immaculate, maintained to a standard that would have made her old crew chiefs proud. Climbing the ladder to the cockpit felt like ascending to an altar. The ejection seat embraced her with familiar pressure, the 5-point harness clicking home with satisfying finality. The cockpit was more modern than what she remembered, glass displays replacing many of the analog instruments, computing power that would have seemed like magic 2 decades ago. "Viper 61, this is Tower," crackled through her helmet. "You're cleared for engine start. Winds calm, runway 21 right, altimeter 30.12. "Tower, Viper 61, cleared for start," Eva responded, her hands already moving through the startup sequence. Muscle memory returned like an old friend, battery on, fuel pumps on, throttle around the horn to idle. The General Electric F-110 engine spooled up with a sound that reached into her chest and squeezed her heart with its familiar power. The displays came alive, presenting information in ways the A-10's steam gauges never could. Eva took a moment to appreciate the technology, then compartmentalized it. Tools were tools. What mattered was the pilot using them. "Viper 61, taxi to runway 21 right via Alpha Echo," Tower instructed. As she released the brakes and began rolling, Eva noticed the crowd had grown. Among them stood Colonel Bishop, his presence making this more than a routine check ride. The F-16 responded to her inputs with an immediacy that surprised her. Where the A-10 had been like wrestling a bear, the Viper was like dancing with a partner who anticipated your every move. Reaching the hold short line, she performed her final checks. Everything showed green, systems nominal, no reason to abort. Yet her hand hesitated on the throttle. 7 years was a long time. 7 years of cargo runs, of straight and level flight, of avoiding anything that might remind her of what she'd been. Viper 61, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 21 right, tower announced. Winds calm. Viper 61, cleared for takeoff, she responded, rolling onto the runway centerline. The vast expanse of concrete stretched ahead, heat already beginning to distort the far end despite the early hour. Eva advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the engine response through the airframe. At military power, the acceleration pressed her back into the seat. She watched the airspeed indicator climb, 60 knots, 80, 100. At 120 knots, she eased back on the stick. The F-16 leaped skyward like it had been waiting for permission, the ground falling away with startling enthusiasm. Gear up, flaps up, climbing through 1,000 feet before she'd even reached the departure end of the runway. "Good morning, Viper 61, came a new voice on the radio. "Nellie's control, radar contact, climb and maintain 15,000, heading 270 for the MOA." The military operating area stretched across thousands of square miles of Nevada desert, a playground for fighter pilots to push their aircraft and themselves to limits impossible in civilian airspace. Eva climbed steadily, reacquainting herself with the F-16's personality. Where the A-10 had communicated through vibrations and sounds, the Viper spoke through subtle pressure changes and the whisper of airflow over control surfaces. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and began her series of required maneuvers. First, gentle turns to feel the aircraft's response, then progressively steeper banks. The F-16's fly-by-wire system made it almost impossible to stall or depart controlled flight accidentally, but Eva wasn't interested in what was safe. She needed to know where the edges were. A barrel roll, smooth and coordinated, the horizon rotating around her like she was the axis of the world. An Immelmann turn, trading airspeed for altitude in a graceful arc that left her inverted before rolling upright. With each maneuver, rust fell away like old paint, revealing the pilot underneath who had once been considered one of the best in her generation. "Viper 61, Nellie's control, be advised, you have traffic at your 3 o'clock, 5 miles, flight of 2 F-22s from the 422nd. Eva looked right and spotted them, 2 Raptors in formation, probably curious about the new arrival performing aerobatics in their airspace. On the radio, she heard, "Ghost 21 flight, this is Viper 61, morning." "Morning, Viper 61, came the response. "Heard Iron Wolf was back in the sky. Mind if we observe?" The call sign rippled through her like electricity. Even here, even now, the legend preceded her. "Ghost 21, you're welcome to watch, but try to keep up." What followed was not combat, not exactly, but something closer to a dance with death as a distant partner. Eva pushed the F-16 through increasingly aggressive maneuvers, each one designed to test both aircraft and pilot. The Raptors followed, their superior performance making it look easy, but she wasn't trying to outfly them. She was trying to outthink them. In combat, Eva had learned that technical superiority meant nothing if you could predict what the enemy would do. She led the F-22s through a series of maneuvers that looked random, but were actually carefully orchestrated to position them where she wanted. Then, at the perfect moment, she executed a knife-edge pass between them, the F-16 sideways in the air, close enough that she could see the surprised expressions of both Raptor pilots. "Jesus," one of them transmitted, forgetting radio discipline. That was. "Ill-advised," Eva finished for him, already rolling away. "But possible. Remember that when you're fighting someone who has nothing to lose." The rest of the flight was more conventional. System checks, approach procedures, everything required to certify her as qualified in the F-16. But something had changed in those moments of aggressive flying. The ghosts that had haunted her for 7 years seemed lighter, less substantial against the bright Nevada sky. Returning to Nellie's, she was cleared for a straightened approach to runway 21 right. The landing was textbook, gear down, flaps extended, airspeed bleeding off in carefully controlled increments. The main wheels kissed the concrete with barely a chirp, the nose wheel following a moment later. As she rolled out, Eva realized she was smiling, really smiling for the first time in years. The crowd at the flight line had tripled. As she shut down the engine and opened the canopy, the desert heat rushed in like a physical presence, but she barely noticed. Colonel Bishop stood at the bottom of the ladder, his expression unreadable. "How was it, Major?" he asked formally, though his eyes betrayed satisfaction. "Like riding a bicycle, sir," Eva replied, unstrapping from the seat. "If the bicycle could go Mach 2 and carried missiles." As she descended the ladder, something unexpected happened. Someone started clapping, then another. Within moments, the entire gathering was applauding, not the polite golf clap of military ceremony, but genuine appreciation from people who understood what they'd just witnessed. Lieutenant Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching reverence. "Major, that knife-edge pass, how did you know they'd be positioned exactly right?" "Because I made them be there," Eva replied simply. "In combat, you don't react to what the enemy does. You make them react to you. Control the engagement, control the outcome." The crowd parted as she walked toward the debriefing room, but she could hear the whispered conversations behind her. Iron Wolf, the hero of Shaikat, the pilot who defied orders and saved a battalion. The legend was reforming, but Eva knew the hardest part was still ahead. Flying was one thing. Teaching others to survive when everything went wrong was another entirely. In the debriefing room, Volkov had already pulled up the flight data on the main display. Every parameter was within limits, technically perfect despite the aggressive maneuvering. But Eva noticed something else, a small graph in the corner showing G-forces pulled during the flight. She'd peaked at 8.7 G during one particularly aggressive turn, near the F-16's maximum limit. "You were pushing it pretty hard," Volkov observed carefully. "In combat, the enemy doesn't care about your comfort zone," Eva replied, studying the data. "Neither should you." She turned to face the younger pilot. "What's the maximum sustained G-force you've pulled?" 7.2, Volkov answered. "Training or combat?" "Combat, Syria, defensive break against a SAM launch." Eva nodded approvingly. "Good. You felt the edge. Most of these kids haven't. They know the aircraft's limits from books and simulators, but they've never had their vision tunneling while someone's trying to kill them." She pointed to the G-force graph. "This isn't showing off. It's showing them that the limits they think exist are mostly in their heads." The door opened, and Colonel Bishop entered, followed by 3 other officers Eva didn't recognize. Their bearing and the intelligence badges on their uniforms suggested they weren't from Nellie's. "Major Kowalczyk," Bishop said formally, "these gentlemen are from Air Combat Command. They've been monitoring your return to flight status." The lead officer, a brigadier general with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair, extended his hand. "General Harrison, I've been following your career for some time, Major, both the official version and the real one." Eva shook his hand, nodding the firm grip and direct gaze. "Sir." "We have a situation," Harrison continued, his tone suggesting this wasn't a social call. "3 weeks ago, we lost an F-35 over the South China Sea. The pilot ejected safely and was recovered, but the aircraft went down in disputed waters. The Chinese have announced they've recovered the wreckage." "That's a significant intelligence loss," Eva said carefully, unsure why they were telling her this. "It gets worse," Harrison said. "The pilot reported that before ejecting, he observed Chinese aircraft performing maneuvers that exactly matched our aggressor tactics, specifically, tactics developed and supposedly kept within the 64th Aggressor Squadron. Tactics that shouldn't exist outside this base." The room fell silent. The implication was clear. Someone had leaked classified tactical information to a potential adversary. We need someone with combat experience and a proven ability to think unconventionally to help us understand how this happened, Harrison continued. Someone who's been outside the system long enough to see it clearly, but skilled enough to recognize what's important. You want me to investigate your own aggressor squadron, Eva said. It wasn't a question. We want you to do what you've always done, Harrison replied. Find a way to complete the mission when conventional approaches have failed. He paused. There's another reason we're telling you this. The leaked tactics included specific counters to the A-10's gun runs, tactics that were developed after studying your actions in Shai Kot. Eva felt the room temperature seem to drop. Someone's been studying me. Someone's been studying Iron Wolf, Bishop corrected. The legend, not the person. But now that you're back, that distinction might become important. General Harrison placed a classified folder on the table. This is everything we know so far. Officially, you're here as an instructor pilot. Unofficially, you're helping us understand how our enemies learn to fight like us. He met her eyes. Are you willing? Eva thought of the young pilots outside, eager and skilled but untested. Thought of threats from unknown numbers and buried investigations. Thought of Boxer Chen and 217 soldiers who'd lived because she'd been willing to break the rules. I'm willing, she said, but I do things my way. No interference, no second-guessing, and no burying the truth when I find it. Agreed, Harrison said immediately, which told Eva more about the severity of the situation than any briefing could have. After the general and his entourage left, Eva stood alone with Bishop and Volkov, the weight of this new mission settling on her shoulders. She'd come here to fly again, to teach. Instead, she'd walked into something that could reshape the balance of air power in the Pacific. Welcome back to the game, Iron Wolf, Bishop said quietly, though I'm not sure this is the game any of us expected. Through the window, Eva could see the flight line where F-16s were being prepared for the afternoon's training missions. Young pilots walked past, their confidence evident in their stride. They had no idea that their tactics, their training, their secrets had already been compromised. But they would learn. Eva would make sure of that. Captain Volkov, she said, turning to the younger pilot, I want to see recordings of every aggressor flight from the last 6 months. And I want to know everything about every pilot, instructor, and maintainer in this squadron. She paused. The enemy isn't just learning our tactics. They're learning them from someone who understands them well enough to teach. That's not espionage. That's betrayal. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Eva made her way to the secure facility where the aggressor squadron kept their tactical development files. The building looked unremarkable from the outside, just another tan structure in a base full of them. But inside, it held the accumulated knowledge of decades of aerial combat, refined and evolved through countless engagements both real and simulated. Master Sergeant Patricia Huang controlled access to the archives with the fierce protectiveness of a dragon guarding its hoard. Her desk sat like a checkpoint between the mundane world and the classified one, every visitor scrutinized, every access logged. Major Kawoksik, Huang said, her voice carrying a subtle accent that suggested childhood years spent somewhere in Southeast Asia. General Harrison's office called. You have unrestricted access. The way she said it suggested this was unusual, possibly unprecedented. Eva signed the access log, nodding she was the only visitor that day. Sergeant Huang, how long have you been managing these archives? 14 years, ma'am, since before the F-22 program went operational. Huang's dark eyes studied Eva with intelligence that suggested she was more than just a document guardian. I remember when your tactics from Afghanistan were first incorporated into the curriculum, revolutionary approaches to close air support. And who has accessed those files recently? Eva asked, keeping her tone conversational. Huang's fingers flew over her keyboard, pulling up records. In the last 6 months, 17 individuals, all properly cleared, all with legitimate need to know. She paused. But there's something interesting. 3 accessing officers viewed the files multiple times, always late at night, always for extended periods. Who? Eva leaned forward to look at the screen. Major Thompson, Captain Martinez, and Huang hesitated, Lieutenant Colonel James Crawford.